From 793 AD, when the Vikings first descended on Lindisfarne, their legend was born. Not just as invaders, but as men who fought like wolves with nothing to lose. Who were these men from the north? What kind of life breeds such brutal precision? This isn't just a tale of conquest, it's the unraveling of a people forged by hunger, frost, and death. The Vikings didn't become warriors by choice, their world gave them no other option. The ashes of Lindisfarne had barely cooled before whispers of these northern phantoms spread like wildfire. But to understand how the Vikings became so good at combat, you must trace their ferocity back to its origin, not to the battlefield, but to the bitter, unforgiving world that birthed them. Every Viking child was destined to fight and was raised under the constant pressure of nature's wrath. At age 7, boys joined hunting parties in the freezing forests. They learned to track animals, navigate rough terrain, and endure pain without flinching. Some even sparred with dulled weapons to mimic real combat. There were no safe zones, no second chances. This was a world that trained every limb, every nerve, every instinct. But it wasn't just the body that was hardened. Their minds were forged in stories, tales of gods who rewarded courage and punished cowardice. Imagine being told night after night that dying in battle was not failure but glory, that fear was dishonor, that pain was proof of life. And so, generation after generation, young Vikings were sculpted into something terrifying, not just warriors, but believers in battle. So by the time a Viking picked up a real axe or stepped aboard his first longship, combat wasn't a profession. It was a continuation of the only thing he'd ever known, endurance through suffering. The battlefield wasn't an escalation, it was familiar territory, and that is the first secret. Before they ever met an enemy, the Vikings had already conquered their harshest foe. Surviving the cold in an open ship as they crossed through dangerous seas taught Vikings how to endure, but it was their bond with each other that taught them how to fight. Once they had weathered the trials of childhood and joined their first expedition, young Norsemen weren't lone wolves, they were a pack. A Viking didn't fight for glory alone. He fought for his kin, for his clan, for the man beside him who had pulled him from the snow or stood back to back with him in a tavern brawl. They called it Drengr, a code of honor that demanded bravery, truth, and an unbreakable brotherhood. To die in battle was noble, but to abandon your shield brothers, that was the kind of shame no saga would forgive. And so they trained together, lived together, bled together on the battlefield. Their bond wasn't born in war, it was tested there. But what made them terrifying wasn't just their loyalty, it was their mindset. They believed that death was not the end, but a doorway. Those who died bravely in combat were promised entrance into Valhalla, the warrior's paradise where the fallen fought and feasted for eternity. This wasn't superstition, it was psychological armor. When a man believes he cannot truly die, he doesn't hesitate. He becomes a weapon. Even rituals reflected this belief. Before battle, warriors smeared themselves in war paint, chanted oaths to Odin, and sometimes bit their shields to summon rage. To them, fear was a luxury. Battle was a test of worth. A Viking entered it not to survive but to be remembered. This unshakable unity, fused with spiritual fearlessness, made Viking combat more than coordinated violence. It made it unbreakable will made visible, but if loyalty made them fearless, training made them lethal. And what they did to prepare for war is the part most never saw. Brotherhood gave Vikings purpose, but purpose alone doesn't win wars. Preparation does, and the Vikings prepared like no other. Training began early and never truly ended. Shield walls were their signature, interlocking defenses that turned individuals into moving fortresses. Warriors drilled relentlessly to hold formation, advance as one, and shift with fluid unity. A break in the line could mean death for all, so their cohesion, rooted in loyalty, was now refined through repetition. But Vikings didn't rely solely on brute force. They practiced versatility. They could throw spears, wield long axes with deadly arcs, or grapple when the enemy got too close. Many trained in wrestling and hand-to-hand combat, knowing that on a slippery deck or muddy field, strength meant nothing without control. Then there were the berserkers, warriors who trained not to suppress fear, but to override it entirely. Through meditation, fasting, isolation, and sometimes hallucinogens, they induced trance-like states before battle, turning into human storms, howling and biting shields, driven by something between rage and religion. Their presence on the battlefield was psychological warfare in motion. But what truly set Viking training apart was environmental adaptation. These were men who could row for days, then leap from their ships and sprint straight into battle. They trained in wet clothes, frozen forests, rocky beaches, embracing discomfort as part of the fight. Where other armies needed rest, Vikings needed only momentum. They didn't just train to swing weapons, they trained to outlast, outmaneuver, and unsettle. They knew that victory wasn't just in killing, it was in breaking the enemy's mind. And when that moment came, when they were finally ready to strike, they had something else up their sleeve, something their enemies never saw coming until it was too late. If the Viking body was forged by suffering and their hands trained by repetition, then their greatest weapon wasn't steel or shield, it was wood, the longship, sleek, silent, fast. It turned the Viking into more than a warrior, it made them a phantom. While their combat skills prepared them for the clash, it was the longship that chose when and where that clash would happen. Built to slice through both oceans and rivers, these vessels could land almost anywhere. Harbors, beaches, marshes, even upstream villages thought unreachable. Their training wasn't confined to land. Vikings rode through storms, steered by stars, and memorized coastlines. Sea and ship became extensions of their bodies. Raiding parties could travel hundreds of miles, attack at dawn, and disappear before the first horn blew. The enemy often didn't even know what had hit them, only that something terrible had passed through. The longship's design was revolutionary, symmetrical bow and stern, allowing it to reverse instantly. A shallow draft meant it could glide over just a meter of water. The dragonhead prow wasn't just for fear, it was a psychological prelude. Many towns surrendered at the sight of one, but precision was key. These weren't drunken marauders bumbling into villages. They timed tides, monitored wind, and calculated tides. Raids were strategic, surgical, and terrifyingly efficient. And when the oars finally stilled, their combat training took over. Shield wall formations struck with speed, and coordinated teams moved from ship to loot in seconds. And yet, for all their tactics and terror, most forget one important truth. The Vikings weren't just warriors. They were traders, farmers, blacksmiths, men with mouths to feed and winters to survive. Every battle, every raid, it had a purpose beyond death. It had a price tag. Because when you strip away the blood and glory, there's a deeper reason why the Vikings fought the way they did. War paid, and no one understood that better than they did. So, what happens when a warrior society also becomes an economy built on combat? That answer lies not in how they fought, but in what they gained from fighting. The longships delivered warriors, but they returned with wealth: silver, livestock, spices, slaves, tools, silk. To many, Viking raids seemed like chaos, but behind every swing of an axe was a motive as old as time: survival and reward. The truth is, Vikings weren't just mindless invaders, they were men with families and winters to endure. Combat wasn't just a cultural expression, it was an economic strategy. A single successful raid could buy livestock, tools, land, and even social status. For Vikings, war wasn't a disruption of life. It was a seasonal business model. Viking society rewarded the bold. Kings didn't hoard spoils from raids, they were divided among the crew. The more you fought, the more you earned. And the more brutal and daring you were, the higher your cut. It wasn't just about bloodlust, it was about calculated risk and measurable return. This also meant that training, loyalty, and tactical discipline weren't just spiritual or honorable, they were pragmatic. A warrior who broke formation didn't just endanger his brothers, he jeopardized everyone's payday. Raiding success depended on flawless coordination, lightning speed, and shared gain. Even cowardice had a cost. Those who failed to prove themselves in battle could be cut off from plunder, or worse, exiled. As Viking influence grew, so did their economic reach. Many raiders settled in conquered territories, not as invaders but as landowners and rulers. Places like Normandy, Dublin, and parts of eastern England bear the legacy of these transactions born in war. Some Vikings even entered the service of foreign kings as elite mercenaries, trading their skills for gold instead of glory. This mythological mindset became a weapon in itself. When a man believes he gains everything by dying well, fear evaporates. That's why Viking warriors didn't break when outnumbered. That's why berserkers could charge into shields like animals. They weren't trying to survive, they were trying to be chosen. Since the most powerful of all was how they honored their fallen. Viking funerals weren't quiet, they were spectacles. Longships set ablaze, bodies adorned with weapons, prayers to Odin sung over flames. These weren't just farewells, they were declarations to the gods that another warrior was coming home. And so, when you put it all together, the training, the brotherhood, the strategy, the economy, the belief in legend, it begins to make sense. The Viking wasn't just a soldier, he was a storm, a survivor, a soul on fire, and now perhaps you understand why they were so good at combat. If this journey into Viking life pulled you in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more epic history brought to life. Skál, warrior, your saga has just begun.